Today is Friday, June 9th, and this is William Michael of the Classical Liberal Arts Academy. Yesterday, I received a request from a friend who asked if I would talk a bit about my relationship with my wife. And this request had a specific interest, which I think is an important issue to talk about. He asked whether, through the years, my wife and I have always agreed on things, or have we disagreed on things, and when we have disagreed, how have I handled those disagreements? I think this is an important issue to get into. Before I get into it, though, I want to say that the talk I gave yesterday on how to make progress as a family is really key to understanding my relationship with my wife and my children, because while I don't think I've ever articulated the concept of family life as clearly as I did in that talk yesterday. That concept of family life has always been with me, even though, like I said, I haven't articulated it as clearly as I did yesterday using the illustration of the tornado. And so before you listen to this talk, for it to really make sense, I recommend that you listen to that talk given yesterday on June 8th on how to make progress as a family. I don't remember if that was the exact title of the talk, but it's something like that, and it's got an image of a tornado on the video thumbnail, so you can probably find that. The relationship between a husband and a wife has some principles that need to be followed. There's an order in family life, just as there's an order in the church, just as there's an order in the state. When a man marries a woman, he takes upon himself responsibility. He's the head of the household. And when he takes that role upon himself voluntarily through marriage, he becomes accountable to God for that household. And so this is serious business, and this duty to God is ultimately what directs everything that the man does. He's responsible to God for this household that he, the man, establishes when he marries a woman. And because of this responsibility, the man has to lead both his wife and his children according to God's will. And this is some dangerous work to voluntarily undertake. It's one of the reasons why I shake my head at modern talk about marriage, because normally we have kids who are dating and who are immersed in thoughts of pleasure and romance, talking about getting married with no talk about the moral responsibilities of married life. There are many men who get married who are completely incapable of fulfilling the duties of a head of a household. Men who are completely unprepared to be the head of a household. They're thinking about sex or other pleasures of married life and thinking of none of the responsibilities. And this is as contrary to the nature of marriage as you can get. When we think that marriage is a sacrament, it's a sign of something deeper and more profound. It's a mystery that represents the relation between Christ and his church. A man, before getting married, should be thinking, do I think of my wife or this woman who I intend to marry as Christ thinks of the church? And am I prepared to be for this woman what Christ is to the church? That's what marriage preparation should be about. Not trying to keep college kids from fornication because they've been put in a completely unnatural living situation, being asked to remain celibate until they're 23 years old while living in secular society. Marriage is not an escape or a permission for sexual relations. It's a lifelong relationship that has serious objectives. It's a relationship in which the man and the woman take vows before God to love and care for one another until death. There's nothing in this life that compares to these vows, except for final vows in religious life, where a monk or a nun takes a vow to live according to a certain rule until death. Marriage is serious business, and it's rarely taken seriously. And sacred scripture teaches us very clearly how serious it is. Jesus forbids divorce. And you can make up any kind of modern excuse for divorce. You can talk about annulments, but all of that stuff, at least in my opinion, all of that stuff is subject to God's judgment. We know Christ is very clear when he teaches about divorce. And he doesn't think to include any exemptions except one. He says because of uncleanness. That's it. He doesn't list 25 different circumstances in which it's okay to break a marriage up and separate. No, he mentions one. So I think we need to consider marriage and married life and the responsibilities that a man voluntarily takes upon himself with a vow before we start talking about the relationship between a husband and a wife. Now, the importance, and I already expect that there will be some people who object to things I say in this talk, but all I say is, if you disagree, point out specifically what I say that's false, point out specifically any conclusions I draw unreasonably, and provide evidence for your disagreement. I have reasons for the things I say, and I'm very confident saying them. It's common for modern people who are influenced by feminism and American egalitarianism and all of these ideas of equality and all this stuff to trample teachings of sacred scripture. And people seem to think that as long as you get a bunch of likes on your Facebook post, or as long as a bunch of people around you agree with you, that somehow makes you right in what you say. But Scripture teaches very clearly that in a family, the husband is the head of the household. He's the head of his wife. And the relationship between the husband and the wife is compared to the relationship between Christ and the church. So if we're going to say that there is some equality, that there's no difference, that the man and the woman are equal and all this, then whatever you say about the man and the woman, you're going to have to say about Christ and the church. Christ and the church are not equal. Christ is the head of the church. The church is told to obey all that Christ has commanded in the Great Commission. Christ commands the church, and the church obeys Christ. And yet at the same time, Christ loves the church, and he gave himself completely to death for the church. And not just his death, but his whole life. He gave his whole life for the church. And the church extends not only to the wife, but to their children. So when a man talks about this headship over his wife, that's always got to be married to ultimate responsibility for the whole household. And this is where this macho man talk about men being in charge of their wives usually breaks down. Because all that it means is that the man is responsible and accountable for everything. So when I think about my household, my marriage, my family, I understand that the buck stops here. I'm responsible for everything. I'm accountable for everything. That's what it means to be the head of the household. That's why the household has my name, because I'm the one who's accountable. I'm responsible for everything. So you can see how perverted it is to twist that into, I'm the boss, I make all the decisions, everything serves my will. All of that would be true as long as you also say, and I'm responsible for everything. Now, the reason why I take the headship of my household seriously is because I also take responsibility seriously. I'm responsible. My wife's not responsible. My children are not responsible. I'm responsible. And if you think back to the image of the tornado that I talked about yesterday, I'm responsible for the tornado. I'm responsible that it moves where it's supposed to move. Despite all the chaos, despite all the trouble, despite all the difficulties, all the obstacles, when all is said and done, I'm responsible for the direction of this tornado, for keeping the tornado together and moving all of its contents to its end. I'm responsible for that. So if it turns out that my wife were to be a bad woman, I would still be responsible for moving the household to its end. If it turns out that my children, in their free will, choose to be disobedient, I'm still responsible for my whole household moving towards its end. I don't get excused because my wife chooses to disobey God. I don't get an excuse because my children choose to disobey God. I'm the head of the household bears my name, and when all is said and done, I'm going to have to give an account to God for the household. So I really don't understand the macho man act where men put their foot down and talk about they're the king of the castle. The king's the one who gets executed by the enemy army. The king is the target of the enemy. And ultimately, the king is accountable to God for his kingdom. And that's always got to be kept in mind whenever we talk about any man being the king of his castle. All that means is he's responsible for everything. Now, when men don't have experience in leadership, they often love this idea that being the king means dressing yourself in purple robes, wearing a big golden crown, and strutting around telling people what to do. Many people have that idea of a king. Many people talk about tyrants and kings as if they simply walk around commanding people to do their will. But that's because they're ignorant of how real kings actually live and operate, especially through history. Most people who have that idea of a king have never studied the history of kings, because that doesn't work. When kings try to command subjects without taking responsibility for the success of the kingdom and the welfare of all subjects, those kings end up assassinated, and the people don't submit to them very long. For a king to rule, his subjects must trust him and love him and willingly serve him. Any other attempt at government simply leads to rebellion. Most people don't realize this when they talk about ancient kings, because they hear stories about how this king would execute all his enemies, and this king would do this, and this king would torture people, and they imagine that this is how kings operated. But again, it's an ignorant view of the history of kings. It's not true at all. It may be true of certain kings for a small period of time. But if we go back through history and look at the greatest kings that commanded the greatest kingdoms, we find that that's not how they ruled. Ancient kings tried this. The most ancient kings tried to govern by terror and by force. But the wiser kings quickly learned that this doesn't work. We can talk about the great Assyrian kings, and we can talk about the great Babylonian kings, and imagine these violent, powerful kings ruling over their subjects like slaves. But their kingdoms didn't last very long, and they usually were only powerful because of certain circumstances that gave them an opportunity to govern by force or by violence. And after a little while, they were knocked off the hill by someone who wasn't interested in submitting to their violent rule. It was the Persians who eventually figured out the key. The Persians established the greatest empire. And just to put things in chronological order, the Persian Empire ruled the entire Eastern world until it was conquered by Alexander the Great. And Alexander the Great conquered the East, just to give you an estimated date that's easy to keep in mind, around 330 BC. So even though the Persian Empire fell to Alexander, the greatest conqueror in world history, who never ruled himself because he quickly fell also, what's important about the Persian Empire is they figured out the method for governing a great empire. And what the Persians figured out was that if a king rules gently, the people will submit. And what the Persians did most famously, if you think about the accounts of the Persian Empire and how they interacted with God's people in the Old Testament, the Persians learned that it's easy to collect tribute from people, from your subjects. It's easy to govern your subjects, to collect taxes or tribute, as it was referred to, if you grant them freedoms in things that they take seriously, most importantly in their religion. So the Persian king, unlike the Assyrian kings who mocked the religion of the Jews, unlike the Babylonian king who tried to make all people worship him as a god, the Persians learned that if you let the different peoples maintain their religious beliefs and ceremonies, they'll be willing to pay their taxes. They'll be willing to submit to such a rule. And this is what the Persians did. In the Old Testament, we read that King Cyrus of Persia freed the Jews from the Babylonian captivity after the Persians conquered the Babylonians. Cyrus freed the Jews and paid for the reconstruction of Jerusalem. We read about this in the books of Ezra and Nehemiah in the Old Testament. Cyrus freed the Jews from captivity and allowed them to return to their land and reestablish the worship of God and all of the Jewish ceremonies and traditions. And this was the concept that really made a breakthrough in the history of government. That if people were granted some freedom, they would submit to a king, especially freedom in things that were most important to them, like their religion or local tradition and culture. So even though the Persian Empire eventually fell to Alexander, the principle of effective leadership was established. And this principle was most famously taken up by the Roman Empire. And this is what led to the famous Pax Romana. The Romans were friendly towards their subjects and left them with great freedoms. And in exchange for that gentleness, most of the nations, most of the peoples who came under the power of the Roman Empire did so voluntarily. The Jews, for example, after the death of Alexander the Great, when they came under the oppressive rule of Alexander's successors, they actually appealed to the Romans for help and voluntarily submitted themselves to the growing Roman power at that time. That's why when the New Testament opens, the Jewish people are under Roman rule. And life is actually pretty good under Roman rule. The only time we hear about trouble among the Jews during the Roman Empire is when the zealots, whom Jesus discouraged, chose to try and revolt against the Roman power, and they got their brains smashed in every time they tried. And eventually, because of their continuous uprising, the Romans leveled Jerusalem and carried the Jews away into slavery. That wasn't because the Romans willed such, it was because the Jews would not stop trying to revolt. In 70 AD, the Romans destroyed Jerusalem. Jesus, during his life, discouraged that zealot behavior and refused to participate in it. On many occasions, these Jewish zealots, these political Jews, tried to get Jesus to take some political position. They tried to make him king at one point. The zealots, like Barabbas, hoped that Jesus would lead the Jews in rebellion like some ancient Maccabee. But that was not Jesus' intention. Jesus said, "My kingdom is not of this world." And you can imagine how the Jewish zealots were frustrated by the fact that Jesus taught the Jews to pay their taxes, to give to Caesar what is Caesar's. So Jesus discouraged the political ideas of the zealots. They refused to listen to Jesus' teaching, and Jerusalem was sacked as a result, 40 years after Christ ascended into heaven. But this principle of tolerance, this principle of gentleness, has always been the principle that brought the greatest success to kings and empires and governments through history. And it's this principle of tolerance that we see in God's government of the world and in Christ's government of the church. We see this principle of tolerance, this principle of patience, this sort of loose management of human beings. And it's necessary because human beings are unlike any other creatures. Human beings have free will. Human beings are strange creatures. If you push a human being too hard, he might just kill himself. Other creatures won't do that. A human being will consider, in many circumstances, his freedom to be more important than his physical life. And if he feels that his freedom is being taken away, he'll kill himself. And this makes human government different than any other kind of management. For example, I live on a farm. I've raised and kept every kind of animal, from dairy cattle and draft horses all the way down to chickens and sheep. Animals are very easy to manage. They're moved by natural instincts and desires, and all the farmer has to do is order the farm to manipulate the natural desires of the animals, and the farm is at peace. Once in a while, there will be a rowdy animal, and sometimes these can be big, powerful animals. We had 2,000-pound draft horses on the farm at one time, and if one of those got angry, there was no way to physically restrain it. The same is true with a dairy bull, for example. When you've got Jersey dairy cows, they're considered some of the most beautiful and gentle breeds of cattle, and yet the Jersey bulls, are among the most dangerous, the most violent and powerful. And these things have to be managed, and there's no way that human beings can simply rely on physical strength to control a 1,500-pound bull or a 2,000-pound angry draft horse. The work of the farm teaches a man how to learn to manage subjects. When you've got a herd of 40 hogs or 30 sheep, you quickly learn that an individual strong man, by his strength, can't control a herd of sheep, can't control a herd of hogs. A man's got to learn how to control different animals, some strong individuals, some easily scattered herds. And the work of the farm teaches a man to become wise in leading others, And that wisdom can help in the family. But as I said, human beings are not like sheep. They're not like horses. They're not like cattle, because they have this spirit of freedom, this free will within them that they will always defend. And this free will always has to be respected. God himself manages us human beings with freedom. And I learned this concept one time because I had a young bull that was dangerous and was wild. And I had to figure out how to bring this bull under control. I had to figure out how to actually handle this bull and calm him down, tame him, and make him relax under my control. Now, when he was younger, he was wild from birth. When he was younger, I used to try to get a hold of him just to sort of break his spirit and make him subject. And he would fight the whole time. And I'd eventually have to give up and just lock him in a stall. And he started to get bigger, and this became more dangerous. And I would get him on a halter, and I'd hold the halter as tight as I could, and I would constrain him physically and make him stand by me and walk calmly beside me. And he would fight the whole time. And I would grip that rope tighter, even grip the halter itself, or grip one of his horns. And I would grip and hold him and constrain him as tightly and strictly as I could. But he would fight and fight. And then I would let go, because I didn't want him to get hurt, and I didn't want him to have an increasingly bad experience anytime I handled him. And finally, I learned in handling the cattle that if I would give him some slack on the halter rope and allow him to jerk around a little bit, but keep the rope in my hand, but give a little bit of slack, rather than grip it tightly and try to force him. If I gave a little bit of slack and just led him slowly, he would go with me. And I had to learn this concept of leading strongly but loosely. And it's a complex idea to understand unless you've actually done it. To hold the rope tightly, yet control the bull loosely. You see, there's some complexity in management. The same thing is true with a herd of animals. If you try to lead them quickly and forcefully, they'll scatter all over the place. You've got to move them along in an orderly way, slowly. And so I would send one of my kids out in front of the sheep to just slowly walk from the pasture back to the barn. And I'd have my son just walk slowly ahead of them, and I would stand at a distance behind them, and I'd have a stick or something in my hand, and I would just make some noise. I would simply make my side more uncomfortable for them than the direction that I wanted them to go in, and they would slowly move, following my son who led them. Didn't even pay attention, just slowly walked in the direction they were supposed to go. And I would just make the space behind them less comfortable less attractive than the space in front of them, and they would slowly move into the barn. I had to move them strongly, but slowly. And so a lot of these concepts are learned by people who handle animals. They certainly would have been known by ancient people who handled animals much more commonly than we do today. Now, as I said, leading people, human beings, is different because of free will. Because human beings are more shrewd. They're deceitful because they're shrewd, because they have understanding. And they can feel when their freedom is being forcefully taken from them, and they instinctively rebel against any such attempt. And so leading people requires a very different disposition, and this is what we learn from the Persians and the Romans. We learn how to use a Roman phrase, to make haste slowly, to be strong but gentle. This is how human leadership works. This is how a man governs a household of human beings. It requires strength, but it requires a gentle strength. The strength of the man is seen by the fact that his family moves as it's supposed to move. The strength has much more to do with patience than any kind of violent activity. It's not the strength of fist fighting. It's a strength of perseverance. And this is what most men who talk about being heads of households don't understand. They don't understand these concepts of management and leadership. We hear people say things like, it's hard to soar like an eagle when you're working with a bunch of turkeys. Another saying is, it's hard to make chicken salad out of chicken manure. I'll spare the language. But the truth is, this is what leadership actually is. Leadership doesn't mean you get together a team of people who don't need a leader. You don't get together a team of excellent winners and go win. Leadership takes what it's given and leads them to the desired end. That's what real leadership is. And the leader takes personal responsibility for the outcome and pursues that outcome at all cost to himself. This is what it means to be the head of a household. And when a man signs up to be head of a household on his wedding day, he has no idea what he's going to be dealing with. He's agreeing to carry out a mission, but he has no idea what the people will be like that he has to lead to that objective. This is true of his wife to some degree. This is true of his children. This is true of his own life circumstances. He has no idea what the circumstances will be, and he unconditionally commits to a mission. It's pretty wild when you think about it. But this is what family life is. So, with all of that as the background, my wife and I met in high school She was from an evangelical family. I was a street kid, a public school punk. I converted to Christianity when I was 18 years old, and my conversion was very serious, and I began studying as the effect of my conversion. Whatever grace was given to me through my conversion led me to study. And that's what I've done for 30 years now, nonstop. I moved on a pretty sharp incline from my initial conversion to pretty serious Christian thought and practice. My wife wanted to do so, but she came from a very different background. And we disagreed on many different things. And we have disagreed on many things all through our marriage. But what's most important about my wife is that she has a few things that are the non-negotiables. My wife fears God. When all is said and done, my wife wants to obey God. My wife is virtuous. She's temperate. She's chaste. She strives to be prudent. She's courageous. She's a virtuous woman. When you read Proverbs 31 and it talks about the virtuous woman, my wife fits that description. She fears God, and she's virtuous. Now, those are general qualities. And I could say the same about myself. I could say that I fear God and I'm virtuous, objectively speaking. Both of us share those general qualities. But in the day-to-day living of life, where we've got to make all kinds of decisions and choose all kinds of ways to do things, these decisions depend on lots of moving parts. They depend on changing circumstances. They change on our ability to predict what's coming in the future. And they can be very complicated and uncertain. And therefore, even though you can have two people who fear God and live virtuously, they can disagree on all kinds of practical details, all kinds of details of life. And the disposition of a mother is by nature very different from the disposition of a father, especially when you've got a household full of boys, as we do. And so there are disagreements, not on general principles, but there are disagreements on the application of those principles, the timing of different decisions, the degree of different decisions, and so on. These things are complicated. But we've got to remember this principle that the attempt to rule someone by force, and in the family life, this would apply to a man trying to rule over his wife and children. Human beings do not submit to violent government. They don't. It just doesn't work. And a man is responsible to bring his wife and children to the end of the Christian life. Now, he's not responsible to make them saved. Obviously, only God can do that. But he's responsible for things that are within the reach of human ability, for which he is humanly accountable to God. He's responsible for his own modeling of Christian behavior. He's responsible for the order of the household. He's responsible for what he introduces to the family and the effect that it has. He's also warned in the scripture not to exasperate his family members, not to wear them out. And so he's got to learn how to govern them and lead them and move them as human beings. And this has to be done gently and patiently, and as I mentioned in a recent talk, by means of compromise. Compromise means settling for an intermediate success when an absolute or final success is not yet possible or would cause more harm than good. Finding middle ground, as we say. But the word middle ground is misleading because it sounds like something in the middle, and it's not necessarily in the middle. It's closer to the goal than nothing. You know, a good illustration of this, one time we had a couple of trees in our yard that we needed to have cut down and removed. And the tree company sent out an estimator, and he came and gave us some crazy price, $400 per tree. And you think these guys could cut these trees down and remove them for a couple $100. Definitely not necessary to ask for $400 per tree. So what do? They walk away with $0. And you wonder, is it really worth pushing for your desired price so strictly that you're willing to walk away with $0? And that company was willing to do that. And I said, that's really stupid. You're sort of taking business for granted. You're taking it for granted that you can turn down business like this. And that's the attitude that gets you in trouble. Because there's someone else who's willing to come along and you give them the opportunity to enter into the market. And so, spite yourself, you walk away with $0. Whereas business requires compromise. That's the whole nature of business. It's compromise. And when you get this macho man culture, the macho man culture, you've got the guy worrying about what his buddies think. And so he tries to play macho man, and he ends up losing everything. Because he thinks compromise is a sign of weakness, rather than understanding that compromise is a part of the strength of leadership that takes responsibility for bringing the family to the desired end in the long run. Not necessarily immediately, but in the long run. With this image of the tornado in view. So we've got to lead gently, and we've got to make use of responsible compromises to keep everyone moving forward without ever threatening human freedom or just spitefully trying to leap ahead to a desired end that no one is ready for. And it may sound cute for someone to talk tough and say that that's what they're going to, but they're not going to do it. There are Christian families with children who are killing themselves over their parents' strict rules. How can a father, for the sake of his supposed commitment to getting to the end, justify pushing a child to self-destruction? How is he going to give an account for that child? Is he going to pretend he's like Cain and say, what, am I my brother's keeper? Yes, you are. Dummy, that's the whole point. How could you possibly think that pushing and pushing and pushing to that extreme was actually fulfilling your duty, which was to bring that soul to the desired end? And I know this is common because in my small circles, I'm not a very social person. In my small social circles, I've seen it several times. I saw it when I was a Christian school teacher. I've seen it as a publisher who hears talk among homeschool families. If you try to push people contrary to their will, which is actually caused by your laziness and impatience rather than any imaginary strength, you could actually drive them to the opposite and worst possible outcome, and you're accountable for that. How many Christian families, how many Catholic families have had marriages end in divorce because tough guy was putting his foot down? Well, tough guy's got no wife anymore. And he's accountable for his household. I remember a few years back, there was some nutcase guy like this who was so intensely on top of his wife and kids all the time that he would inspect every lesson of their homeschool and complain and criticize everything. He actually wrote me an email one time complaining that a petty school reading, a preschool reading lesson, was teaching what he called nominalism. He was a maniac, just constantly driving with this idea of authority of a husband and father, all in the name of this tough guy Christianity, king of his castle. Well, he lost that wife and he lost those children to divorce. That's the outcome of that fake strength. It's not strength. We don't see that in Christ. We don't see that in God himself. We don't see that in any saints. And we don't see it in the greatest leaders of history. If you actually would study the history of government, Roman history, you would find that the greatest leaders were clement. They were gentle. King David in ancient Israel is an example of this. How many times did David have Saul in his grasp and choose to let him go? When David finally killed Saul, or when Saul was finally killed, and they brought Saul's son into David's presence, what did David do? David let him go. David was a clement ruler, and his subjects loved him because he was a gentle ruler. Strong, but patient. Respectful to the weaknesses and disagreements of his subjects, and willing to accept intermediate successes as he continued to move towards long-term, final success. So when we talk about the relationship between a husband and a wife, yes, there are going to be disagreements all the time, even between God-fearing, virtuous people, because the details of all of these decisions are complicated. They're contingent on lots of uncertain things. We have preferences. We have aversions to certain things. And so if there's two options and I am averse to one and my wife is averse to another, we're going to disagree and oppose each other, but there's really nothing wrong. And so what happens as the head of the household is I've got to decide if there are two good things available. I don't like one, my wife likes what I don't like. Is it good for the sake of our household to let my wife have this way because both options are good, and I simply accept giving over on this issue for the sake of moving the whole family forward? And that's how compromise works. This is true when I disagree with my wife on practical issues, when I disagree with my children, even on practical issues. There are times where I will give my kids their way because it's not that big of a deal. Doesn't get in the way of our family moving forward, and in fact, in the long run, may actually help us move forward. Because our relationships are important. Our present relationships influence future decisions that they make, and so on. I'm willing to take present apparent losses for the sake of long-term victories. It's strength, but it's a gentle strength, patient strength. At the same time, there are certain issues that I really put my foot down on, and I refuse to budge, and I'm not going to budge. There are certain issues where I cannot compromise. And we have disagreements on an issue like that, and I have to dig my heels in and say, no, this is one issue where we are not going that way. We're going this way, and that's that. Now, you might say, well, isn't that just going to provoke the whole rebellion and fight and all this? Well, it could, but when your wife and children know that in many other issues you're willing to yield, and they see that on this issue you're not willing to yield, they can't say you're just a jerk, you're just a tyrant, all you want, you make us do your will. That's not true, and everybody knows it. And so when that time comes for you to say, no, this is an issue that, no, we're doing what I say on this issue, and that's it. You've got an established reputation of being willing to compromise where compromise is possible, and it sends a signal to the whole family that this is a serious issue because Dad is not willing to compromise on this issue. And you can see how the reputation of being gentle allows you to be strong at certain times, and it shuts the mouth of anybody who wants to try to argue that you're a jerk. It's not true. Now, there are times where these disagreements can get pretty intense, where there's a real argument between, let's say, my wife and I on an issue. And we can argue back and forth, and we can debate things back and forth. But when all is said and done, as a last resort, I can take out the card from my pocket and lay it on the table, which says, "Wives, obey your husbands." And that can be my final answer. And I don't use that card much, but I do have that card, and I can use it. I can put that card down and say, "Wives, obey your husbands, full stop." And even though my wife may be upset or disappointed, as I said, my wife is a God-fearing woman, and she knows that that's true. And as much as it might make her upset on a certain issue, that discussion will end, and that'll be it. That'll be it. The same is true for my kids. If there's an issue that we disagree on, and I refuse to budge, and I know that I cannot budge on this particular issue, I'll put that card down on the table that says, "Children, obey your parents." Final answer. Now, if you think about all of that in the context of that whole family life that I described, you can see why it's not a cause of great family breakdowns and all kinds of craziness. My wife knows that I'm willing to yield if I can. She knows that, and frankly, I'm not trying to fight for every little advantage like a wimp. I'm willing to have things go in ways that are not in my best interest, because I can handle it. And whenever there's a sacrifice that's to be taken, whenever there's a sacrifice needed for the family, the head of the household is the one who's supposed to take that sacrifice. He's supposed to be the one who bears the difficulty. That's what it means to be like Christ. So if there's something that's good for my wife and good for the kids but bad for me, I can accept that and bear with it. And that's what it means to be the head of the household, for the good of the whole family. This is true with lots of things. For example, family diet and things like that, activities the family does. I often accept the uncomfortable circumstances and let my wife and kids have the more comfortable circumstances because that's better for the family. I don't ask my kids to sacrifice for my sake, as I know many fathers do because I see it. We see fathers who preach to their kids about eating healthy and not eating between meals and all this kind of stuff, while dad does the opposite of all that he advises. And that experience in the kid's memory, remember, establishes the reputation, which undermines the father's authority. That's not serious. That's not serious. There's one rule for dad, and there's one rule for everybody else, and that's just hypocrisy. And that doesn't work. Because the day when you do need to put your foot down, those years of hypocrisy are going to embolden your kid to just say, "I'm out of here. I don't care. I hate you. I don't want to be here anyway. I hate living here." And the kid's right, because that kid has had to live like a slave, subject to a hypocritical ruler who doesn't practice his own principles. And you can point to the kid and say, "Oh, the kid rebelled," but you're partly responsible for that because you contributed to it. And women do the same thing as mothers. How many women disobey and disagree and argue with their husband and talk bad about their husband behind his back, and then turn around and tell their daughters to obey them, and it's like, "Yeah, right. Nice try. Nice try, Mom. Nice try. Go ahead, preach the duty of obedience when the whole family watches you disobey every day." So no one falls for this fake leadership. But if you practice the faith day in and day out, and as the head of a household you actually think about and imitate Christ day in and day out, when those times come where you've got to be strong and uncompromising, there's nothing anybody can really say, because as soon as it comes out of their mouth, everyone in the room would know it's ridiculous. "Oh, Dad, you're such a jerk. You never..." Everybody knows that's not true. There are 100 things that go on in my house every day that my wife and kids all know that I hate, but I tolerate. because I choose my fights. I don't want to have a kid kill himself because I choose to play macho dad and high-five my buddies when we talk about how strict we are. I don't want to have a wife who divorces me because I'm a jerk. And I can sit there and high-five my buddies as we sit alone at the bar together, talking about how masculine we were when we were married. I'm responsible for my wife to bring her to the end that God wills. I'm responsible for my kids to bring them to the end. And it doesn't matter how difficult that process is, or how costly it is, or how scattered the way may prove to be. All that matters is that we reach the end, in the end. That's the ultimate challenge. And these details of the different personalities my kids have, the dispositions my wife and kids have, all of the challenges that they present to my life and my activity, my work, and so on, those are simply the obstacles that God has set before me, which give me the opportunity to merit eternal reward. God never gives us more temptation than we can bear. And so when I see a difficult trial or obstacle put in my path, I have to tell myself, God knows that I can overcome this. And He's giving me an opportunity to earn a reward by doing so. And that's what this life ultimately comes down to for a man who's a husband and a father. So no, my wife and I disagree on all kinds of stuff. We argue all the time. My kids will be the first to tell you that. And we've had times where our kids have asked us, why you and mommy argue? Because we're married. And because we're never going to divorce. We're never going to divorce. So if there's a problem, we're going to have an argument. Because there's no other way out except through it. And we don't agree on this thing, and there are decisions that need to be made, and those decisions have consequences. And so there are going to be arguments. But the reason why there are arguments is because there will be no divorce. And we understand that. We understand that the arguments are circumstantial. The arguments are arguments. They're not personal. We met when we were 17 years old. We chose to get married when we were young kids with no children, no business pressures, no financial pressures. All of these things of married life, they have nothing to do with our relationship. And we know that. And even when we argue about something, we know we're arguing about something. And our kids understand that, because now, 25 years into our marriage, our kids see that our life is happier and better, and our relationship better than ever, because we're maturing together and life is getting simpler as we get older and calming down, and a lot of the most stressful times are behind us. So anyway, I hope that answers the question. I think it does. And that's an honest answer. I think that as a husband and father, my family is moving forward and upward, little by little over time, as a tornado moves, as I explained yesterday. And I've just learned that anytime there's a sacrifice to be made, to take the sacrifice on myself, because it's much easier for me to bear than for my wife and kids to bear. And I'd rather bear it and leave them happy, leave them at peace. Let them go play while I bear this difficulty. Let my wife go to bed early while I stay up and bear the stress of a certain situation or try to find a solution to something. I bear the burden, and I try to keep those burdens off my wife and children. That's what I think gives them a happy life. And, we say that man is stronger than the woman, that the woman is a weaker vessel. Well, this is what I believe that strength is for. So anyway, that's how our relationship has always worked. But remember, my wife and I were together as teenagers. We really love each other. We spent our whole adult life together. We're together every single day, all day. So even if there's an argument, we're together all day, every day. And I think we do a good job of keeping that in context. And also as Christians, we know that we sin. And when we sin, we confess our sin. If I snap at my wife about something, after I calm down and think about it, I'll go find her and tell her I'm sorry for getting angry or for being impatient or for snapping at her. Confess my sin because I am sorry for it. And she'll do the same thing. And everything's back to normal. That's how confession works. The church teaches us that. Christ teaches us that. So there's constant reconciliation. There's constant growth in each of us personally, and things just get better and better as we get older. So anyway, I'm going to cut this off there. I hope that answers that question. I hope that's helpful. If there's anything else you'd like to talk about, or if there was something else you were hoping for me to get into that I didn't get into, just let me know. But I hope that's helpful. God bless.